Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this first session of the 2024-25 Joint Speaker Series of the American Society of International Law's Interest Group on International Law and Social Science, and by the European Society of International Law's Interest Group on Social Science and International Law. I'm Mark Pollack. I'm co-chair with Karen Alter of ASIL's ILAS section, and it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers and our two discussants for today's session. Our speakers today are Beth Simmons and Gino Pauselli, who are presenting a paper entitled From Barriers to Abuse, Border Hardening and Torture Allegations. So very briefly, and forgive me for leaving out many of your achievements, Beth Simmons is Andrea Mitchell University Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, where she researches and teaches international relations, international law, and international political economy. She is the author of two hugely influential books, Who Adjusts? Domestic Sources of Foreign Economic Policy During the Interwar Years, and Mobilizing for Human Rights, International Law in Domestic Politics, which my graduate students are reading, by the way, next week. And she is currently in the midst of a major project on international border crossings, from which today's paper is drawn. Gino Pauselli, Beth's co-author, is assistant professor of political science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He was previously a PhD graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton. His research uses advanced statistical methods to explore the politics of norm adoption and norm resistance, among many other topics, and his work has been published in International Studies Quarterly, the Journal of Peace Research, the Journal of Democracy, among others. And to discuss Beth and Gino's paper, we are very fortunate to have two expert discussants, Adam Chilton and Ezgil Yildiz. Adam Chilton is Howard G. Crane Professor of International Law at University of Chicago Law School, where he serves as an editor of the Journal of Law and Economics. His primary research interests lie at the intersection of international law, comparative law, and empirical legal studies, and he is the author of several books, including How Constitutional Rights Matter with Mila Versteeg, and Trial by Numbers, A Lawyer's Guide to Statistical Evidence with Kyle Rosema. And he is the author of many articles on a wide range of topics, including, for today, public support for and opposition to the use of torture. Ezgi Yildiz is Assistant Professor of International Relations at California State University, Long Beach, and a research affiliate at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Her research is interdisciplinary, like everyone on this panel, at the intersection of international relations and international law. She is co-editor with Nico Krish of a recently published book, The Many Paths of Change in International Law, with Oxford University Press, and most relevant to today's discussion, she's the author of the 2023 Cambridge University Press book, Between Forbearance and Audacity, the European Court of Human Rights and the Norm Against Torture. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Beth and Gino, who will speak collectively for about 25-ish minutes. Then we'll hear from Adam and Ezgi for about 5 to 7 minutes each. And that should leave us plenty of time for Beth and Gino to respond and to take questions from the live audience. So live audience, if you'd like to ask a question at any point, please type it into the Q&A, and we'll work through those questions here with our speakers over the next hour. Okay, Beth and Gino, over to you.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction, Mark, and I appreciate the sponsorship both by the European Society and the American Society for International Law to study, to support this forum in which we can talk about our study and our research. So let me just begin by saying that I feel like what is happening, I need to disclose, of course, what's happening at international borders around the world is really very difficult to study. And we acknowledge this for a number of reasons. It's a very sensitive security area, so don't approach a border and try to take a lot of photos or things like that. It's a politically divisive issue, so one needs to walk carefully among the many minefields. And yet I think international law scholars really do need to be very concerned about this area. And I sort of came to that conclusion by a fairly recent publication by the Special Rapporteur for Torture, who looked specifically at border areas and reported that torture and inhumane acts are in many cases, quote, the direct or indirect result of policies and practices adopted by states with a view to deterring, punishing, or controlling irregular migration. So these are practices that I think really do deserve our scrutiny as scholars and practitioners and advocates of international law, we should be giving close attention to what is going on at the international borders of the world. And it's crucial to understand, I think, the ways that border policies can undermine and enhance human rights. Lots of minefields. We're going to present some evidence in this piece, and I want to admit right off the bat that we are dealing with a certain kind of evidence that is not ideal, but it is the very best that we can do at this point. We're dealing with credible allegations of torture. We do not have proof. We certainly do not have convictions. And we are dealing with very tricky problems of inference that have to be dealt with very carefully. And yet, it seems to me very important that we do so because ideas seem to have developed that borders are somehow places of exceptionalism when it comes to state behavior, and I really want to resist that idea. We need to expect human rights to be honored by border and immigration officials just like we would any other official associated with the state. So it's crucially a policy relevant idea. I also think it's important to start by defining what torture is. I know that this group almost certainly knows the international legal definition of torture, and we follow that definition of intentional physical or mental pain or suffering by officials for purposes of confession or punishment. But I want to be clear what we don't include, which today might include torture. So we are excluding many acts that might now be, and in fact are, considered by many people to be torture at international borders. Family separation policies, long waits, crowded detention facilities, and those kinds of other conditions that one often hears are the conditions that migrants meet when they cross borders. But what we're concentrating on in this piece are the core acts of torture that scholars have been studying for a long period of time. So we didn't want to include new interpretations, and in fact we decided to use this very conservative test of acts of torture to really be those kind of core physical integrity rights that have long been understood since the 1980s to be part of the definition, international definition of torture. But we absolutely acknowledge, and I do not want for a minute to belittle the other aspects of torture that can be practiced by border and immigration officials as they try to control or deal with migrant populations or other forms of border crossing. We had three findings essentially in this piece. We find, first of all, that there's no relationship between torture allegations of border and immigration officials and state agents generally. So we really need to search for a different kind of a theory or explanation for torture for this particular group of agents compared to general agents of the state, for example. So there's no relationship between torture by border and immigration officials and state agents generally. We find also that reports of border torture are likely to increase when states erect border barriers. And this is kind of going to be the core aspect of our theorizing. And third, that leaders increasingly anxious and angry, border-relevant rhetoric intensifies the signal that a border barrier sends to border and immigration officials, which in turn, we will argue, has an impact on their the way they behave at the border and the kinds of treatment they render to migrating or border crossing persons. So we can change the screen now, the slide. So let me just say just a little bit about kind of the theoretical framework that we are looking to use here. First of all, we are dealing in the setting largely of a border environment, or at least a bordering environment. And this involves conditions with the potential for lots of human rights abuses. Dehumanization and othering, there's a large literature on borders and othering, and in-group protective kinds of behaviors. Crisis framing, that is susceptibility to moral panic and other forms of anxiety. And this is also a setting that is often very hard to monitor. And as we began to kind of scan through the torture literature, we realized that these are the kinds of conditions that some people have argued increase the possibility and possibly even the likelihood that torture will be chosen as a way to deal with other human beings. We're dealing with a set of principals who we consider to be the policymakers who decide what border policy is, and we theorize that they can have reasons to signal their position on border control to relevant public audiences and, of course, to border and immigration officials, which we're going to be referring to as BIOs, border and immigration officials, throughout this presentation. We're kind of agnostic about the reasons why they might want to send that signal. It might have a political reason or a programmatic or a practical reason. We don't judge that, but instead we assume that they have a signal that they're sending, both in their rhetoric and in their public investments, that sort of raises the salience of border issues. Agents pick up on these signals. Border and immigration officials we consider to be an example of so-called force agents in this research. Now, what is a force agent? These are agents that are studied all the time in public policy. They operate in the domain of violence, just like police and like the military. They commonly have the authority to use force if that turns out to be necessary, just like militaries and police forces would have that kind of authority. And they are professionally tuned and trained to pick up on threat signals. So these are the kinds of agents whose activities we're going to be observing. And then we theorize the signal itself, and we kind of zero in on this idea of border barriers. Now, of course, in some ways, border barriers are shorthand for border policies more generally, but they're an especially sharp and credible and clear signal. They're salient, they're visible, they're costly, so it's not just cheap talk. And we argue essentially that border barriers essentially signal two things. First of all, what they signal is that there's a growing threat. So a wall, or the erection, the announcement of the need for a wall, sends a signal for hypervigilance at the border. Secondly, it signals that migrants themselves may be threats. Instead of viewing them as vulnerable populations, it tends to transfer some of the sense of threat onto the actual crossers themselves. So a threat signal or threat perception is enhanced when borders are erected. And then I think also we think very importantly is that erecting a border wall in particular, or border fencing, also signals importantly the principal's priorities. And this just sort of says this is how important it is that we secure the border, that we make this kind of an investment. And so we hypothesize an empowerment mechanism. Empowerment is the authority delegated to someone to act. And BIOs will infer that they have greater discretion to exert their authority as force agents when they see that a wall has been announced and is starting to go up. And one reason is that barriers themselves are exceptions in many ways. There have to be legal waivers to build them. Sometimes the state exercises eminent domain, and there's a suspension of normal freedoms around border areas. So walls communicate, we think, to BIOs that there is the possibility here now of the suspension of ordinary rules if need be. And now may be the time that it's necessary and useful, possibly, to suspend ordinary rules. We do consider the possibility that borders just don't send a signal all by themselves, but that they can be amplified with rhetorical kinds of messaging as well. Language that suggests how important it is to securitize. Language that suggests how angry the leadership are at the possibility of border pressures of various kinds. The anxiety that border conditions sort of signal that there's something risky or threatening on the other side of the border. And often these are transferred to migrants themselves. So from the above mechanisms then, we think that it's very likely that there are going to be important consequences. That these can be refracted through, they can be sent directly from a leader, and there's just a graphic here now to put up, Gino. that these can be sort of sent directly to border agents from a leader, but they can also be refracted around through a border bureaucracy, for example, a border security bureaucracy, who develops a culture around the signal that is being sent by the principal. And again, as I said, that this can clearly interact with angry kinds of rhetoric to intensify behaviors that have consequences. So now let me turn to those consequences. We expect essentially three kinds of results from this. First, as we were saying, that as I said earlier, there's no relationship between this dynamic we're talking about with border agents and immigration agents and other state agents. So walls have a functionally, spatially, and perhaps bureaucratically specific kinds of effects. And we don't expect that to show up for other kinds of agents of the state. This is a signal that's fairly directed. They have much less effect, if any, on other force agents of the state, like police or prison guards or the military. And border enforcement torture has the same logic then, but it's triggered by very distinct threats and priorities being communicated. Secondly, reports that bios have committed torture are likely to increase when states begin to erect the barriers. This is the main and central hypothesis that we have. And then thirdly, that the likelihood of torture reported is associated with commencing a border wall is when it's combined with leaders' increasingly anxious or angry rhetoric, there is essentially an amplification effect, and torture may be even more likely. I'll turn it over to Gino now to go through some of the evidence.
Thank you, Beth. And yes, so the second part of our presentation deals with how we test these expectations. And to test these, we use data that was collected by Conrad, Hangel, and Moore on the Ill Treatment and Torture Data Project, where they quantified allegations of torture across different state agents and at the country year level for a limited period of time of 11 years between 1995 and 2005. And we expanded this data set until 2020. So this data basically quantifies in a 5-level scale the level of torture by different state agents in a country and in a particular year. We're going to focus here on allegations of torture by one of these 6 state agents that are border and immigration agents or officers that we call bios. And when we extended the data set, we ask our research assistants to follow Conrad and Moore's codebook in identifying allegations of torture in Amnesty International reports by bios. So with this data, we first look descriptively at the relationship between allegation of torture by bios and the general level of torture in a country. And by our first expectation, we shouldn't expect these two trends to go together. And one way to look at this is how these trends behave over time. And what we find is that these two measures move differently in different directions over time. So first, we have one of the multiple measures on the general level of torture in a country, that is the torture index from the VDEM project. We inverted this index for higher values to represent higher levels of torture in a country. And what we see here is, in the period of time that we're going to be focusing on, is that over time, the average level of torture in the world has decreased. Now, when we look at the data that Conrad and Moore collected and that we expanded focusing on bios, we see a different story, different trend. Over time, on average, the level of torture by bios has increased. So these two trends go sort of in different directions, which suggest empirical support for our first hypothesis. We also ran some other statistical analysis that we're happy to talk about, but we thought that this graphic display was quite interesting. Now we move to our second expectation that focuses on the effect of wall construction on torture practices by bios. And here, to test this second expectation, we ran a set of statistical analyses, both linear and logistic regressions, where our outcome of interest is the level of torture by bios. These 5-level category where higher levels represent more widespread torture by border and immigration officers. Our main predictor in this model is going to be the first year of wall construction. So basically the first year that a wall is erected at the border. And in models, we control for a battery of variables that capture alternative explanations. One of them is something that we mentioned as significant, which is the anxious border rhetoric or angry border rhetoric. And we use Schaffer and Simmons data on leader speeches at the UN and border-specific speeches and how anxious or angry those speeches were to capture this idea of anxious or angry rhetoric. Happy to talk more about the other controls if you're interested, but I wanted to clarify that we are controlling for a bunch of things. So what do we find regarding our second expectations in terms of the relationship between border wall construction, and bios torture? So in the regression analysis, at least 3 models that we present here, we have more, but they all tell the same story. There is a positive and significant relationship between the construction of a wall, the first year of the construction of the wall, and the level of torture by bios. So, this is consistent with our argument that wall construction increases torture by bios. Some of these models control for all the variables that I mentioned. We're not showing them here, but happy to talk about those relationships if you're interested. Now, in terms of our third expectation, that is basically that leaders' rhetoric can amplify the effect of walls, we also find evidence for this in these interaction terms between wall and anxiety or wall and anger. So here the relationship is positive and significant, suggesting that the effect of wall increases as the level of anxiety or anger in leaders' speeches increases. But very interestingly is that the coefficient of anxiety and anger by itself doesn't predict higher levels of bias torture, suggesting that the discourse or speech or rhetoric by leaders doesn't have a direct effect on bias torture. It only amplifies the effect of the signal that border walls have. And this is, again, evidence in favor of our third expectation. Now, these results hold even after different models specifications are implemented. We also implement the instrumental variable approach to address causal identification problems, and we also find evidence there. However, we are aware that there might be reporting bias concerns here, which basically are that the construction of the wall leads to more allegations of torture because human rights NGOs like Amnesty International look closely or closer to what's going on at the border. And they capture more instances of allegations of torture just because they are more interested at what's going on at the border after wall construction. And to address this concern, we did three different things. So first, in all the models that we run, we control by a measure of what we think it's the level of attention of Amnesty International at the border because of the construction of the wall, by counting the number of times the words wall, fence, and trench were mentioned in a report of a given country. And we include a measure of this in all models. And as you saw, the relationship between our main independent variable, wall construction, and torture of bios holds even after controlling by this. We also implemented placebo test on torture allegations by other state agents. So what we did here is to try to look at whether wall construction predicts higher levels of torture by other state agents. And the reason why we did this is because if there is more attention by human rights NGOs at what's happening at the border, we shouldn't only expect NGOs to pick up more allegations of torture by bios, but also more allegations of torture by other state agents that might be happening at the border. And we don't observe that. So this is basically evidence against this idea that more attention to the border captures more instances of torture allegations. And third, we also analyze anticipation effects. And what do we mean by anticipation effects? When a border wall is built, that happens at a specific time, but before the construction of the wall, there were discussions about whether the wall should be built at the border. There should be negotiations in the public sphere about maybe the budget that the wall construction is would cost, etc. So these should capture the attention of human rights NGOs. And if more attention is, if human rights NGOs are putting more attention on what's going on at the border, we should expect an increase in the level of bios torture right before the construction of the wall, during this time when the construction of the wall is being discussed. To analyze this, we implement an event study of a difference-to-difference design. Happy to talk more about that, but basically what we observe is that there is no significant difference, or at least increase, in the reported level of torture by bios in the period right before the construction of the wall. But we do observe an increase in the level of torture by bios right after the construction of the wall. Okay, that's sort of the evidence that we have. Happy to talk more about other tests that we conducted, and I'll turn it to Beth.
Alrighty. I just will say a few things about what we take away from this. And the first thing I think is that, the finding that essentially torture by bios is not very well explained by some of the other studies that have been put together on the dynamics of torture, essentially. And so we feel like this is a potential contribution just on its own, is to say something different is explaining torture under these set of circumstances. The second thing I think we want to emphasize is that highly visible border policies, and especially barriers, plausibly do send signals. That threat and the priorities of the nation state are sort of becoming increasingly serious, and these are picked up by force agents, by bios. And these signals increase bios' perceived risks. It's dangerous out there, and they intensify their efforts to defend the border. Essentially, this may be an exaggeration a little bit, but at all costs. So they're willing to take harsher action to defend the border, given the nature of the priorities that the state is signaling. And then finally, I think that the evidence does suggest that bios may interpret border barriers as signals of exceptional need for and a tolerance of tactics that can constitute torture. Let me just say a few things that we are not claiming. What we're not claiming. We're not claiming that this is the only signal out there. We think it's a highly visible one, but there are many ways in which states communicate, and this would not be the only one. But we've given you reasons at least to suppose that it becomes a very strong signal. Maybe it's not even the most important, but I do think that it is crucial to be aware that the kinds of signals that the state is sending can influence the behavior of persons who have been charged to carry out orders, essentially, and to secure the state. Crucially, we are not arguing that this is not a theory of bad apples at all. It is not about individuals. We are not saying who is going to torture, and I don't think we would ever do that. What we're trying to say and trying to think through is what are the sort of the systemic kinds of conditions that might lead to these sorts of behaviors that are illegal in international law. And we're looking at the average effect of sending signals. And then finally, I think the thing it's really important to, emphasize is that this is very policy relevant, and we have to be very careful with the evidence for that reason. We have to be very clear it's not a theory about bad apples. It's a theory, though, that does call for policy that increases awareness about what may be happening at international borders. It might call for directed kinds of training to address these issues, and certainly perhaps enhanced monitoring of various kinds. We're fully aware that there's a lot more room to investigate these questions a lot further, and I think one of the most interesting areas that we could begin to investigate have really to do with thinking about parts of the argument that could be tested on the individual level in an experimental setting. So do border barriers really signal an urgent national priority, with the dependent variable being how high a priority do you think securing the border actually is? So there's much more to do here, and we welcome consideration of further ways to think about testing this proposition.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Beth and Gino. I am not going to take any of our time. Instead, I'm going to go straight to Adam for our first set of comments.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. Let me start by saying I thought this paper is absolutely fantastic. There were many ideas that I hadn't thought about before at all. New arguments about torture, who's likely to torture by the bios. And then the paper just keeps moving, just like the introduction short, every section short to the point, and then it's just like new data after new data after new data. I was just so impressed again and again by it, and I'm sure you guys are going to be successful at a top political science journal. But if for any reason something goes haywire, please send it to me at the Journal of Law and Economics, because I love this paper. I have 5 comments of things that you could potentially do or work on to punch it up even more, though. So the first is that I had a little bit of difficulty understanding what countries that we were talking about here and what countries to have in mind. And concretely, figure 2, for instance, shows the rates of torture by bios as a trend line, the mean rate, and shows that it's gone from 2% to 6% of countries or something. But despite having the paper having a long appendix and many figures, there's not just a basic map showing me which 6% of countries that we're talking about. And so whether or not I find any of the theories plausible is a little tough to know, because I think, like most of us that do international things, you look at the countries, you think, does this make sense? Does this correspond to what I'm thinking about? The same thing again, when figure 3 shows the countries that are building the walls, it'd be helpful to just have both the right-hand side and the left-hand side variables that you're focused on, the walls and the bio torture rates, and just clear maps. And even talk about it, like the countries that we see the increases on are in Northern Africa or Europe or Southeast Asia, and they have these qualities. So I could sort of learn what's happening with, right now it feels sort of all in a bit opaque, who is doing the torturing, what qualities the countries have, who's building the walls, et cetera. Now, I know in part this is probably because I know this is part of a research agenda, and so some of those arguments might have come out in the other papers, but as someone parachuted into this paper, I just had difficulty following it. So the concrete version is maps of figures 2 and 3. The broader version is a little more color on the countries that are building the walls and engaging in torture by bios. That's the first thing. The second comment is substantive effect sizes. And here's what I have in mind. The abstract, the introduction, it says like these relationships exist, but without any kind of concrete numbers. Now, when you get to like tables 2 and 3 and you're reporting the results, it's so it's discussed there. But really what's going on is, 6% of countries engage in torture by bios, and X% of countries have border walls, and there's only a 13% relationship between them, and you have 154 countries. At the end of the day, are we talking about like 4 countries built a wall and tortured in the next year, and what that rate is? And so by just saying like countries that build walls torture, you might be left to think that like this is like all of Europe when it could be much, much smaller once you start multiplying out these relationships. And to present an accurate picture of what's going on in the world, although any torture is too much, and I just thought more concrete discussions of in the abstract, in the introduction, we find that X% of countries did this. It increased from Y to Z% over the period of our data. That kind of thing would have been really helpful to put it in context. All right, so that's the second point. Third point. The thing that was surprising to me is the first main finding that's in table 1 of the paper, which is that there's functionally no relationship between these other measures of torture and then the biotorture. And as Beth put it, as the first main takeaway on the last slide was to say, existing theories of repression don't do a great job explaining the biotorture. To me, this finding was concerning in that I've worked with those other data sets that you use as the right-hand side variables for that table. And I would have hoped that they picked up biotorture. What I wanted to measure is like total torture in the country. And if there's some kind of torture just that's orthogonal to those measures, there's a real problem for a lot of papers. And it made me think, what's going on here? What explains why table 1 looks like small, non-statistically significant relationships between the VDEM torture data, the Ferris data, et cetera, and the biotorture in this paper? And I think it's possible a few things are going on. So the first is in that table, you have country and year fixed effects in all specifications, which what means what you're showing is not that countries that torture more on the aggregate have more biotorture. What it means is within country, the variation in VDEM torture is not correlated with the variation in biotorture. But it could be that levels for countries are consistent because you never show a cross-country comparison. Because I would have expected that Myanmar tortures at their border and they torture generally, and that Canada does neither, or something like that, to put it. And the within country results don't show me that. And so I think you both need to show a scatter plot just showing the like country year observations of these 2 variables you're claiming there's no relationships on, and to show without the country year fixed effects whether or not there's cross-country variations and these things are true. Because if the claim is that countries like don't do any torture but they torture at the border and vice versa, and countries that torture a lot but don't bother to torture their migrants is true, that would be weird. And I think instead it's because of the country fixed effects that you're not picking that up. I also think one more minor point on this relationship, the table 1 relationship, is that basically you now have measurement error on the right and left-hand side of your variables because, as Beth started at the beginning saying, like torture is hard to measure. No one can do it perfect. We all know that. You guys seem to be doing an awesome job. But is it possible that part of what's going on is like the VDEM torture has measurement error, your measure has measurement error, and as a result, we don't find a statistically significant relationship, unlike maybe like something like the wall, or in like your past work, human rights treaty ratification. In those instances, those right-hand side variables, those independent variables, are measured more accurately. And so the difference in the relationship is not about like an underlying fact in the world, just that when you regress 2 noisy concepts against each other, sometimes what you find is noise. All right, so that's the third point. Fourth point, once you get to the analysis of the relationship between the wall and the levels of biotorture, I had 3 quick thoughts on it. First, I found the event study framework the most persuasive research design for it, and I thought that addresses a lot of identification concerns. And so I think that it would be worth making that the main specification and arguing why actually by using, for instance, the Callaway-Santa Ana and showing the non-existence of pre-trends, it's pretty persuasive that there's a clear relationship here. So I put that first. Second, The placebo attests that you have in the appendix about the police, military, etc., I also found super persuasive. And I would consider making that a main table because that really is consistent with all of the prior claims that you make. Finally, um, uh, it would be helpful on this specification if you interacted in this part, the wall, with the other torture variables. And what I have in mind here is my instinct would be that you would see higher biotorture levels from countries that both have a wall and are prone to engage in torture, and that's really where you'd see the biggest effects. And so the interaction of wall plus, whatever, the VDEM or the Siri or the Ferris torture measure, to get at this, and even maybe some sort of triple diff design in the sort of event study framework might get at this even more. Because I would think it would be the kind of countries that torture and then they build the wall are going to torture their migrants. All right, fifth and final point briefly is it might be helpful in either at the start of the introduction or in start of sort of the background theory section to tell from one of these reports the story of just exactly what's going on here. Because as in the comments that you gave, you pointed out you're not talking about like family separation exactly, and you're not talking about long waits, and you're not talking about like lack of food at the camps. You're talking about like border guards torturing migrants. And so I was just kind of curious what they're doing it for, where it's happening. And so just even one story as a plausibility probe in the text of the paper taken from an Amnesty International report, so we can sort of have an image or an idea of the kind of phenomenon we're talking about that's more concrete, I thought might be helpful. All right, thanks again, and I'll stop there.
Those are indeed, Beth. Those are fabulous, Adam. Thanks very much. And I will turn it over to Ezgi.
Perfect. Thank you. Hey, everyone. It's so nice to be part of this important discussion. Like Adam, I really like this project. I think it's a compelling study that addresses the human rights consequences of border hardening, something we see a lot these days. And I think one of the strengths of this paper, it's distinct theory of torture by bios, right? This is different from abuses carried out elsewhere. I think this is an important contribution. And the paper has also have a lot of important policy relevant findings. So while paper is methodologically sound and rigorous, I thought a few aspects could be clarified further. And I also want to talk about the future directions and what we can do more with this kind of material. First of them is the indigeneity concerns, right? I know that you employ the instrumental variable approach, which addresses this, but to me, it still remains unclear whether border walls are solely as a response to security concerns versus if there are other unobserved factors there, like domestic pressures, the rise of xenophobia, like a bunch of other things might be going on there. Because the question is, what causes nations to build walls? Oftentimes we have the dehumanization of others at the gate, but then there's something else predating that, right? Predating the walls and announcements. And a bit of a discussion of that would be interesting, maybe through that vignette that Adam suggests as well. That could be interesting. And like Adam, I also wanted to see a longer explanation of your data. What kind of countries are we talking about here? It's a little hidden there. And if there are any regime characteristics that stood out to you in this, right? For example, I thought another control variable you could use maybe is under international law, there are safe country designations, right? Safe country of origin, safe third country. I wonder if there's any relationship with your findings, if you could use this as a control as well. And I want to know more about the numbers and size of bio cohort, right? Like we can assume that certain type of people are attracted to this kind of jobs, but then I'm also assuming that wall announcements and this kind of mobilization come with larger hiring at the borders as well. I don't know whether you have that kind of data. It would be good to see if there's any correlation between the size of bio cohort and torture allegations. Another question is I think this came a bit clear in the presentation, but the difference between old walls, extended walls, in new constructions, right? You mentioned that the first year of the construction has the most significant effect, but it wasn't entirely clear to me the effect of the old walls or the extension of the old walls. And it would be nice to distinguish that as well. Do we see, for example, fewer violations on the older walls, and most of the violations are clustered here? And again, this is something that maybe you can come over by talking more about your data. And relatedly, I was wondering about the invisible walls here. And by invisible walls, I mean migration control deals, such as the one between Turkey and the EU, right? Do they have a role to play? Because some of these countries are signing on to this kind of agreements as well. And that might also condition the way they are treating migrants at the border. Finally, for policy implications, I thought the paper had really important policy implications. But I was wondering, one of the implied policy recommendations you have is that there should be no more walls because of such risks. And I wonder again if your findings can help us understand the safe country designations, because this is, I'm not entirely sure that, when countries are making these designations, they do consider this kind of findings that you're presenting here. That's why I thought that this is particularly important finding that we should communicate better with the policymakers as well. And some ideas for future, because I really like this project and I want this to continue. One potential direction is to explore how agents in different political regimes, democracies versus more authoritarian states, would respond to border hardening policies. I mean, it can feature in this paper too, but I don't know if you have the scope for adding this. But I was actually curious to know more about if there are any distinctions in the way they treat people at the border and the degree and nature of biotorture. Additionally, this is an international law conversation. That's why I need to ask this question about the role of international institutions in mitigating, aggravating these abuses, right? What is the role of international law here, I wonder? Finally, this is again beyond the scope, but I think this would be really fascinating to extend this to maritime borders, right? This is the moment where we see militarization of the maritime borders in the Mediterranean and across the globe. And I wonder what kind of practices are carried to the sea as well. But overall, I think this is a fantastic project with valuable contributions to academia and the policy world. And I'm really excited to see the interesting discussions that it will generate. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Ezgi. So, my friends, we have about 12 minutes left. And so we have some wonderful people, friends and colleagues in the audience, and we have 3 questions from them in addition to everything that Adam and Ezgi have already given us. So, Beth and Gino, I'm going to leave it up to you guys. Do you want to quickly respond to your discussants? Should we go straight to questions and then give you the last word? How do you want to do it?
Let me just briefly say a couple of things on the last few that are freshest in my mind. Can I do that?
Yes.
I really must respond to the implication that we should have no walls. Ideally, maybe. I don't know. That's so. But I think the main thing is we're accepting that walls are in place. And my own takeaway from that would be that we need to be really cognizant of why torture might take place around borders. And we need to be very cognizant of the training of our officials, it seems to me, and just sort of raising the awareness around these issues. And I don't think that the idea should necessarily be to remove the walls. The signal needs to be interrupted. That's what I think, is there needs to be a way to interrupt the signal that not anything goes. That's really kind of the main thing I wanted to say. But I'm open to answering the rest of the, I think we can, either way. Gino, do you want to say anything?
No, I would prefer to use the few minutes that we have left to collect the questions and try to engage with the audience if possible.
Terrific. So I have 4 questions. We may or may not get to all of them. And several of them are from my colleague Anna van Aken, who is one of the co-organizers of this speaker series. And Anna's first question, she begins saying, "Excellent paper, so many thanks. You said rightly that the wall is just one signal. Do you assume that the wall signal is going straight to bios, or is there a role for public opinion here?" You haven't really mentioned public opinion. Let's just do these sort of lightning round.
Yeah. Can I say something really lightning on that? So I don't think it goes sort of leader public opinion bios. I think it probably goes public opinion, leader, bios, and then there's some complex relationship between public opinion and leaders. But I don't think bios are taking just raw public opinion and enacting at the borders. I think it needs to be more kind of aggregated than that. And that is, I think, what the role of leadership is, essentially. It strikes me as less plausible that they would take sort of a decentralized mood, although that's possible. But it seems to me that this is a crystallization of a lot of that.
And just to add to that, I think that something very important that we find is that other signals, just rhetoric by itself, doesn't have a direct relationship. Mm-hmm. And the reason why is because public opinion or leaders' rhetoric could be noisy, and I think bios understand these, but the physical structure that they see in their daily life, it's also an investment of resources there that signals a strong commitment of the government toward border enforcement, that maybe the rhetoric or public attitudes might not signal that. They could be a signal, but the thing that I think that bios might not pick on that signal as very credible.
Okay, terrific. So second question from our audience is from Adam Lapp, who says, your theory posits a signal from a barrier and leader impacting how bios believe they should act towards people at borders, emboldening them to act more aggressively. My question is, do we actually see lower levels of litigation and punishment for accusations of torture after border walls are constructed as a separate dependent variable from accusations of torture? That's an interesting possibility. What do you guys think?
We're in the realm of speculation, only because we do not have that data. And I'm very averse to saying anything about it. One would hope that there might be just a little bit more litigation and punishment, but all I can do is speculate. One of the real problems in the border space, always with torture in general, but I think in the border space is a strong example of it, is the very difficult problem of holding accountability. So it's very difficult, I think, to get the right data for that, to know how it's filtered, and to sort of question what's going on, because a lot of what's going on is totally justified and some of it is not. And so it's just very difficult to get that kind of data. A lot of filtering goes on through the bureaucracies who handle things internally a lot of times before they are litigated in some kind of a public way.
Yeah, and can I also say that we don't also have sort of the issues that Beth mentioned, but also when we observe litigation, it's usually because the victim reports that. And many of the victims of this type of torture are non-citizens that might face a lot of barriers to getting access into the justice system. And that might be sort of another problem to actually sort of try to observe this relationship.
Okay, terrific. I'm going to go with two more questions from the audience. A second one from Anna, and then one from Teresa Squattrito. So Anna's second question is, could you elaborate a bit on your theory? And specifically, you use psychology and behavioral science. Why do you not explicitly base the paper on those theories? And Anna points out that there's a paper by Regina Jeffries on transnational legal process, where she enriches transnational legal process theory with behavioral science, and her case studies are precisely the behavior of bios. So in a sense, why are you not drawing more on behavioral economics or international law?
We are definitely drawing on behavioral theories, that's for sure. Almost everything we cite in the sort of section that talks about torture itself tries to give a behavioral explanation for it. Some of it is very sort of environmental. Some of it has to do with stressors, which we argued are sometimes very unique in the border. Some of it has to do with the lack of monitoring and decentralization. So these are all kinds of things that we actually do know from the international law and institutions literature, and that we do know from psychological and sociological literature. So I thought we were drawing on that, but I think perhaps what we need to do is make it even perhaps more explicit, but the literature that we cover really does come from that tradition. A lot of it does.
Okay. So Teresa Squattrito has a question that I also thought about, She says, I'm curious about spatial impacts. On one level, it might suggest that a wall might have a more visible impact on bios near the border with a wall. So what can we say about whether or not bios not near the border might respond to a border wall? So at the U.S. northern border versus the U.S. southern border, for example. Can you say anything? Does your data allow you to say anything about that?
Um, do you want to say something? I have something to that.
Gino, go ahead.
So one thing is to sort of understand how we generated the data, how we collected the data. So we coded allegations of torture by bios, regardless of where they were geographically happening. One reason is because Amnesty International usually doesn't reveal where these torture practices happen, but also because bios can have jurisdiction beyond, like inside the country, like far from the border. So there might be spatial concentration near the border that the wall is where the wall is built, but we're capturing also instances of torture allegations by bios throughout the country, regardless whether. If we had
Just for example, ICE would come up in this data set, for example.
Yeah. So if we had the data, if we could potentially observe the full instances of torture by bios, my expectation is that we should observe a bit more of torture allegations by bios located near the border with the wall, because they're exposed to this signal much more than those in the northern border. But we don't have good data to test at.
Okay, well, we are coming up on the end of our hour, but you have so many rich comments that I didn't let you respond to from Adam and Ezgi. So how about if we give you each a couple of minutes to very selectively give your final thoughts before we close? And we can start with Beth or Gino.
Well, Adam, those were great, and all of those are really, I think, taken just in the spirit in which I assume you intended them, is just to really be helpful to help with the elucidation of the data, give examples, tell stories. I think all of that is exactly what we should do if we publish this in a law journal, because as you know, we have a 10,000 word limit in social sciences. So given length, we would love to be able to do something like that. And maybe there's a different version of the paper, but everything you said, super, super helpful. I just want to respond to one more thing. About what about invisible forms of border control? Let's take the extreme, AI. Would I expect the use of AI at the border that nobody quite understands, that nobody can see, that actually in some ways whizzes most of us by, to have the same consequences? Is it talked about in the same way politically? Does it accompany, the language kinds of barriers, not language barriers, but the language anxiety or anger that we've been talking about? It's under the radar. And our theory really does deal with things that are well above the radar and visually impactful, and that trigger the kind of divisiveness that could very well give rise to the behavior that we have here, and the fear and the concern. Gino?
Thank you so much, Adam and Ezgil. These are fantastic comments and feedback. So helpful. I want to respond very briefly to one small point, which is sort of the unobservable variables that might be driving both the construction of the wall as well as torture by bios. Again, we might not be able ever to measure everything that might be going on here. So this is like an ongoing concern no matter what we do. And in another project with Beth and Mike Kenwick, we explore actually the factors that lead to wall construction. And these factors might be much more structural, that have to do with cooperation problems between states and lack of trust, which potentially could drive torture by state agents on the ground. But if that were true, we should also observe more torture by military officers or police agents that might also be exposed to these sort of structural effects between neighbors. But this is a great suggestion because it makes me think that we can explain this a bit better in the paper. Thank you both, Adam and Ezgil. I'll send an email to both of you soon. Thanks. And thanks,
Okay.
Mark, for allowing us to present these.
Oh, Gino, it's my pleasure. So let me thank you both, and let me, by the way, recommend this paper to everyone. Believe it or not, you heard only a fraction of the very, very rich data that Beth and Gino presented in this paper. There's whole aspects of the paper that we didn't even get to this morning. So I want to thank both Beth and Gino for joining us. I want to thank Adam and Ezgi for amazing model comments. I see some of my graduate students in the audience. This is how you provide helpful comments to a speaker. And so let me just some quick final thanks. Thanks again to the ASIL and ESIL social science interest groups for co-hosting this series. Thanks to the ASIL Human Rights Interest Group for co-sponsoring today's session. Thanks to Jimmy Steiner, Taylor Kirkpatrick, and Britta Jalen at ASIL for arranging and hosting our session this morning. And let me finally say that this is only the first session of our joint speaker series for 2024-2025. Later on this year, we'll be joined on December 3rd by Barbara Coromenos, who's presenting a paper on the international politics of geoengineering. And then later in the spring, we will be joined by Mara Revkin, Janina Dill, Veronica Fickfack, Lauga Polson, and others. So please stay tuned for announcements about those future speakers, and we will hope to see you again then. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.